The call came in at 7:14 in the morning, before Nezu had finished his tea. He listened without interrupting. The Hero Public Safety Commission representative, on the other end, spoke in the flat, practiced tone of someone delivering a risk assessment rather than a request. Enrollment numbers at UA were under review. The security audit from last quarter had flagged 3 points of structural vulnerability in the first-year program, and the commission had identified an asset who could address what they diplomatically called gap coverage in crisis response. They wanted Nezu to agree to a temporary placement. 3 weeks, possibly 4. A guest instructor with documented effectiveness in high-pressure student protection scenarios. Nezu set down his cup. What kind of asset? A pause. The classification was still being finalized, apparently. How reassuring. Nezu asked for the full file by end of day and hung up. He received it 2 hours later. He read it once quickly, the way he read everything, and then sat very still for almost a full minute. When his assistant knocked to confirm the afternoon schedule, he told her to clear the last slot and send word to Aizawa that there would be a meeting before homeroom. Aizawa arrived already tired, which was his default state, and took the chair across from Nezu's desk without being invited. He had a coffee. He did not offer to share. You called it urgent. I called it necessary. Nezu slid a single printed sheet across the desk. We have a guest instructor joining Class 1A for the next 3 weeks, beginning today. Aizawa read the sheet. He read it again. His expression did not change. But the quality of his stillness shifted, the kind of stillness that meant he was choosing words carefully. This is a joke. It is not. The HPSC cleared this. They proposed it. I agreed after reading the evaluation reports. Nezu folded his hands. The USJ exercise is in 3 days. The audit flagged our crisis response protocols as adequate under controlled conditions and insufficient under adversarial ones. This instructor's record in student protection under adversarial conditions is, to put it plainly, unlike anything in our existing faculty pool. Aizawa put the sheet down. I don't care what the record says. I don't know this person. My students don't know him. You're placing an unknown variable inside my classroom 3 days before a high-exposure field exercise. Yes, that's a security risk. It is also... Nezu picked up his tea again. A security measure. The distinction depends on which direction the threat is coming from. He picked up his tea again. I've reviewed everything available. His methods are unorthodox. His results are not. And the HPSC's interest in him is partly because he is, shall we say, difficult to classify, which means he operates outside the standard liability framework, which means he can act in situations where our licensed heroes have to hesitate. Aizawa was quiet for a moment. If he's that hard to classify, how do we know he's safe to put near students? We don't know with certainty. Nezu tilted his head slightly. But the evidence suggests that the safety of students is for him a non-negotiable constraint rather than a variable, which is more than I can say for some licensed professionals. He'll be here this afternoon. I'd appreciate it if you gave him a fair evaluation before you decided. I don't do fair evaluations. Aizawa pushed off the wall. I do accurate ones. Good. That's what I need. He came in through the main entrance at 2:47 in the afternoon, and the front desk attendant later reported that she had heard him. Before she saw him, a cheerful, slightly too loud greeting that bounced off the lobby ceiling. And then she looked up, and the rest of the day became harder to explain in her incident report. He was roughly 8 feet tall. He wore a black academic robe and a mortarboard hat with a gold tassel. His face was a fixed, wide smile on a yellow, vaguely spherical head that sat on what could generously be described as a body if one was willing to extend the definition to include tentacles. He carried a briefcase. The briefcase was sized for a human hand. "Good afternoon," he said to the attendant in perfectly clear English and produced a lanyard badge from somewhere inside his robe. "I have a meeting with Principal Nezu. My name is Koro-Sensei. The hyphen is important." The attendant called up to Nezu's office. Nezu told her to send him up. She did, and then held very still for several seconds before deciding she needed more coffee. The meeting ran 40 minutes. Aizawa stood at the back wall with his arms crossed and said 12 words, total, which Nezu noted as more than he expected. Koro-Sensei sat or arranged himself into a sitting posture that approximated the social convention across from Nezu's desk and went through the terms with the attention of someone who had read them 3 times before arriving. His skin shifted colors occasionally as he spoke a pale gold when he was neutral, a faint greenish tinge when something in the document seemed to amuse him, which happened twice. The terms were straightforward. He would function as a supplemental instructor, focused sessionist specifically on crisis response and student protection protocols. He had full authority to intervene if student safety was compromised. He would not speak to press, would not accept external requests for information about his methods, and would refer all institutional queries to the HPSC liaison. UA retained the right to suspend the arrangement at any time with 48 hours notice. He signed with a tentacle in neat, fast handwriting without asking for a pen. "I have one addition." He slid the document back across the desk. Nezu looked at him. "If any student is placed in physical danger and the available licensed personnel are unable to respond in time, I act without waiting for authorization." The delivery was conversational, weightless, the tone of someone noting a preference for window seating. "I don't mean that as a threat to your autonomy. I mean it as a description of how I function. You should know before we begin." Aizawa pushed off from the wall. "That's not how this institution works." "No," Koro-Sensei agreed, "but it's how I work. And the HPSC's interest in me is specifically because of situations where how this institution works is not fast enough." He looked at Aizawa directly, and something in the angle of his fixed smile didn't shift. But the quality of his attention did. "You're Erasure Hero Eraserhead, Class 1A's homeroom teacher. Your record shows you've put yourself between your students and lethal threats on 4 separate occasions without backup. You didn't wait for authorization either." Aizawa said nothing. "I'm not here to replace that instinct. I'm here to make sure there's a second one in the room." He picked up his briefcase and stood. "I'd like to meet the students, if you're ready." Aizawa was not ready, but he led him down the hall anyway, and that was close enough. Class 1. A was mid-afternoon, restless, the particular energy of students who had finished focused work and were now redistributing that focus into low-level chaos. Someone was arguing about hero rankings. Someone else had their desk turned sideways. Midoriya was writing in a notebook with the speed of someone who had just remembered something important. The door opened as the room went quiet in stages. First the students near the front, then the middle rows, then the back corner where Bakugo was sitting with his feet up and an expression that suggested he found most things beneath his attention. He looked up and his feet came down. "Good afternoon," Koro-Sensei said, and his expression was exactly what it had been in the lobby and the meeting room, that same unmoving look, fixed and wide, giving nothing away beyond the fact of its existence. "I'm Koro-Sensei. I'll be working with you for the next 3 weeks. I've read your files, so I know all your names, most of your quirks, and several things about each of you that your other instructors may not have considered relevant." He paused. "Midoriya Izuku, your analysis instinct is a strength, but you use it to delay action under pressure. We're going to fix that. Bakugo Katsuki, your combat effectiveness is real. And it's also the reason you're a liability in evacuation scenarios. We're going to fix that too. His head tilted slightly toward the back of the room. Todoroki Shoto, you have excellent instincts for terrain control, and you use approximately 60% of them. 3 weeks is enough time to change that. The room was very quiet. Everyone else, a pleasant pause. I'll get to you individually. I find that's more effective than a list. Midoriya's hand was already up. How did you read our files? The HPSC provided them. A beat. Also, I read very quickly. Mach 20 for reference applies to most of what I do. The hand went down. Midoriya wrote something in his notebook fast and underlined it twice. Aizawa stayed for the first 20 minutes and then positioned himself in the hallway where he could see through the door window without being visible from inside. It was the kind of observation he did without thinking about it, the same way he tracked exits in unfamiliar rooms. What he watched was this Koro-Sensei move through the room like weather, not disruptively, but with the quality of something that changed the pressure of a space simply by occupying it. He answered questions with the speed of someone who had already calculated 3 possible follow-up questions and was simply waiting. When Ashido made a joke about tentacles, he laughed with what seemed like genuine delight and produced a small wrapped candy from somewhere in his robe and set it on her desk and then kept talking without missing a beat. He was watching them, Aizawa realized. The laughter and the candy were real. But underneath that, the yellow figure was cataloging. Eye movement, posture. Who leaned in and who pulled back. Who laughed a half-second late because they were performing confidence rather than feeling it. Aizawa had been doing that with students for years, and he recognized it when he saw someone else doing it faster. He did not go back inside. He stood in the hallway until the session ended, and then he went to the faculty lounge and stared at his coffee for a while before 13 found him and asked if he was all right. I'm accurate. The distinction from all right went unspoken, and she let it go. Eink, in the classroom as students began to filter out. Koro-Sensei stood at the window and looked down at the courtyard below. The late afternoon light put long shadows across the practice grounds. There was nothing visible to watch, and he watched it anyway. He had counted them when he walked in, 20 students. He counted them again when the first 3 left 17. He would count them at the end of each session until the number stopped being something he needed to verify. It was a habit from a different kind of work, applied to a different kind of purpose. He had made the adjustment before. He knew how to make it again. The last student out the door was Midoriya, who paused with one hand on the frame and looked back. Koro-Sensei. Midoriya kept one hand on the doorframe. The things you said about the files, was that a technique like telling us you already knew things, so we'd feel like we couldn't hide anything? That expression didn't move. What do you think? Midoriya considered this with the focused attention of someone running a calculation. I think it was real information because the specifics were accurate. But I also think you chose which specifics to say out loud and when, and that part was deliberate. Both things can be true. Midoriya nodded once as if confirming something to himself and left. Down in the courtyard, the shadows had gotten longer. 3 days until the USJ exercise. Koro-Sensei stayed at the window a little while longer, not watching anything in particular, and let the number 20 run quietly in the back of his mind, like a count that hadn't finished yet. The gymnasium had been rearranged overnight. That was the first thing Class 1A noticed when they filed in at 8 in the morning. The floor markings were gone, replaced by a loose grid of obstacles. Overturned equipment boxes, a section of scaffolding draped in gray tarp. 3 folding partitions angled to break sightlines. Someone had taped red X's to the floor in 6 different spots. A speaker system in the corner was running a low, intermittent tone, barely audible, just enough to make the back of the neck prickle. Koro-Sensei was already there. He stood at the far end of the room with a clipboard. An actual clipboard held in a tentacle and a stopwatch hanging around what approximated his neck. He had changed nothing about his appearance. The mortarboard was still on. The crescent moon tie was still straight. He looked in every visual sense like a teacher about to conduct a perfectly ordinary lesson. "Good morning." He clicked the stopwatch once without looking at it. "You have 60 seconds to locate all 6 casualties." Nobody moved. The clock started when I finished that sentence. A beat. "You're now at 49. They failed the first run in 31 seconds. Not because they were slow. Ida had crossed the room in 4 strides. Bakugo had vaulted the scaffolding without touching it, and Todoroki had mapped the sight angles within the first 10. The problem was that none of those things coordinated into anything. Ida found 2 red X's and stopped to assess. Bakugo found a 3rd and stood over it, waiting for someone to acknowledge he'd found it. Midoriya ran a calculation in his head so thorough that by the time he started moving, the stopwatch had already reached 0. The tone from the speaker cut to a flat, continuous beep. "Time." Koro-Sensei made a mark on the clipboard. "Casualties located 3 out of 6. Recovery initiated 1. Extraction complete 0. He looked up. "In a real collapse scenario, the 3 you missed were under debris with blocked airways. They are, for the purposes of this exercise, no longer a problem you have to solve." The room went very quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when 20 teenagers simultaneously absorb that they have just technically let 3 people die. "That's not fair." Bakugo's chin lifted. "We didn't know the layout." "Correct." Koro-Sensei's tone didn't shift at all. "You also won't know the layout of wherever you end up when something goes wrong. That's rather the point." Deacon. He gathered them at the center of the room and wrote 5 lines on the whiteboard he'd wheeled in from somewhere. His handwriting was fast and very neat. 1. Count heads before you move. 2. Weakest first always. 3. Keep the exit behind you. 4. If you need help, say so in the first 10 seconds. 5. Nobody leaves until the number matches. This is the 60-second rule. Not a guideline, not a suggestion, a constraint. The same way gravity is a constraint, you don't negotiate with it, you work inside it. He tapped the board twice with a tentacle tip. "Memorize it. You'll use it Thursday." Thursday is the USJ exercise. Midoriya said it under his breath, more to himself than the room. "It is." Koro-Sensei's voice carried no particular weight when he confirmed it. "Which is why we're doing this today and not next week." Bakugo had his arms crossed, and the expression he wore when he was deciding whether something was worth pushing back on. 5 rules isn't a strategy, it's a checklist. "Yes," Koro-Sensei agreed. "A checklist you can run in 4 seconds when you can't think clearly because someone is screaming. That's the whole point of it." He looked at Bakugo without any change in register. "Would you like to argue about methodology, or would you like to run the drill again?" A pause. Bakugo uncrossed his arms. "I thought so. Reset positions." "Deed." The second run lasted 44 seconds before Midoriya froze. He'd found the first casualty marker inside 12 seconds. Good time, clean path, exactly the kind of movement Koro-Sensei had been waiting to see. Then he'd spotted the second marker behind the collapsed partition and stopped. The angle was bad. There were 2 routes around it, and he'd started calculating which was faster. And the calculation had branched and branched again, and by the time he picked a direction, Ida had already covered it, and there was a third marker nobody had touched yet across the room. The stopwatch hit 60. The speaker beeped. Koro-Sensei appeared beside Midoriya without crossing the intervening distance in any way that registered as movement. One moment he was at the far wall, and the next he was simply present close enough that Midoriya had to tip his head back to see the fixed, unreadable expression above him. What happened? Not accusatory. Clinical. There were two options, and I was trying to determine which. How long did that take? Midoriya's mouth closed. He knew the answer. Rule 4. Bandina. You had a decision you couldn't make in 10 seconds. That means you needed help. Did you ask for it? No. So instead of spending 2 seconds to say, I need a second pair of eyes on Sector 3, you spent 11 seconds producing the same result by yourself. He stepped back. You didn't fail because you thought too much. You failed because you thought alone. There's a difference. Midoriya wrote nothing down. He didn't need to. His jaw had the set of someone filing something in a place they won't forget. Third run. Koro-Sensei added a variable smoke. Not real smoke, a stage fogger running along the floor, thickening the air from the knees down. Visibility dropped enough to obscure the red X markers unless someone got within 2 meters. The tarp over the scaffolding moved once as if something under it had shifted, though nothing had. The tone started. This time Midoriya spoke immediately. Ida, take the right corridor. Todoroki, can you clear the center? His voice had a slight strain in it, but it moved, and that was what mattered. Todoroki was already moving. He didn't freeze at the center so much as settle into it one slow exhale. Left hand low, and a thin wedge of ice spread outward across the fog in 3 directions, not enough to stop movement, just enough to mark safe ground. 3 paths opened in 4 seconds, no debris, no obstruction. He'd read the geometry before Midoriya finished the sentence. Bakugo hit the far end of the room like a controlled detonation. Minimal explosion, maximum displacement, clearing his assigned zone in 8 seconds. Then he stopped at the exit corridor and planted himself there instead of moving on. Koro-Sensei watched this from the side. He made no marks on the clipboard. At 53 seconds, the 5th marker was reached. At 58, the 6th. The speaker ran its tone and stopped without the beep. 6 for 6, Ida announced, slightly breathless. Time noted. Koro-Sensei lowered the stopwatch. The skin along his arms had shifted, still the same pale yellow. But the faint greenish tinge from the day before was gone, replaced by something closer to amber. Bakugo, why did you stop at the exit? Bakugo turned around. The question had come from exactly where he expected it. Because if I kept going, the path out got open on one side. Someone had to hold it. Correct. How did you know that there were? A beat shorter than usual, which meant something. Because you said keep the exit behind you. If I moved past it, it wasn't behind anyone. Also correct. Koro-Sensei made 1 mark on the clipboard. You just ran Rule 3 without being told to. That is the first time today someone has done that. He capped the pen. The rest of you should be annoyed about that. Several people were. Midoriya was writing something. He let them run 2 more iterations. Varied layouts, different starting positions, once with the fog and once without, and by the 6th run, the time was consistently under 50 seconds. Not perfect. Kirishima overcommitted twice. Uraraka had a tendency to drift toward the nearest casualty marker rather than assess by distance. But the shape of the thing had arrived a group of 20 moving, with recognizable structure, instead of overlapping impulses. Koro-Sensei called time on the last drill and didn't announce a score. Thursday, he turned to face them instead of the board. The USJ facility runs multiple simulation zones in parallel. You'll be divided into working groups and rotated through each one. The assumption is that your instructors will be present and coordinating. A pause that lasted exactly long enough for the implication to register. Assumptions are worth knowing about. Nobody asked him to finish the thought. The room had the quality of a group that had learned over the course of a morning to hear what wasn't being said. Todoroki had been quiet through most of the debrief. He spoke now, without preamble. You're telling us to be ready to use this without supervision. I'm telling you to be ready, full stop. The supervision variable is for Thursday to determine. He rolled the whiteboard toward the wall. The 60-second rule works whether or not there's an adult in the room. That's why it's 5 lines and not a 20-page protocol. He stopped one tentacle still resting on the board. If you're in a zone and something goes wrong and you can't see your instructor, you will have approximately 60 seconds before the situation becomes harder to manage. I want you to already know what to do with those 60 seconds. Midoriya's hand was moving fast in the notebook. You can write it down. He hadn't looked at Midoriya once. The tone was mild, the kind that comes with having expected exactly this. But make sure you also know it without the notebook. Aizawa observed the last 2 drills from the upper walkway, a position that let him see the whole layout without being part of it. He'd arrived halfway through the session, after the second failed run by accident, then stayed on purpose. He'd seen Koro-Sensei move once during the 3rd drill, when Kaminari had stumbled on a fog-slicked floor panel and begun to go down at an angle that would have put the back of his head into an equipment corner. Koro-Sensei had been 20 feet away. The corner had been covered by a tentacle before Kaminari's weight fully shifted in and out of contact in under a second. And then Koro-Sensei was back in his observation position before anyone else in the room registered what had happened. Kaminari caught himself on the floor, looked around briefly, and kept moving. He never knew. Aizawa filed that away and kept watching. What he was watching for specifically was the moment where the instruction started serving something other than the student's benefit. It hadn't happened. 5 drills in the teaching was still entirely pointed at making 20 teenagers more capable of surviving without the adults in the room, which was either the most useful thing he'd seen all month or a very specific kind of preparation for something Koro-Sensei already knew was coming. He wasn't sure those were different things. That was the problem. After the session ended and the students filtered out, Aizawa came down from the walkway. Koro-Sensei was still in the room, refolding the smoke equipment with the systematic efficiency of someone who had packed things up in worse conditions. The schedule for Thursday. Where did you get the details? Principal Nezu's briefing packet. Koro-Sensei didn't look up from the equipment case. Same one you received. The full packet, with zone rotations and staff assignments. A pause. Yes. That document was distributed to 3 people. Nezu, myself, and 13. Koro-Sensei closed the equipment case. He straightened up and turned, and whatever register his expression operated in that unmoving arrangement of features was now carrying a weight it hadn't carried during the drills. Then I'd suggest that by tomorrow you know how many people have seen it. Aizawa held the look for 2 seconds. You think the count is wrong? I think. He picked up the clipboard and briefcase. That when an institution's schedule reaches someone it wasn't sent to, the next question is not whether that matters. It's how long ago it happened. He walked toward the exit. At the door he stopped, not turning back. The 60-second rule applies to information as well as casualties. Once you know something is wrong, the first 10 seconds are the most important. Then he left the door easing shut behind him with a sound that was quieter than it should have been. Aizawa looked at the whiteboard, which still had the 5 lines on it. He took out his phone and called Nezu. Nezu received Aizawa's call at 9:47 in the evening and did not go to bed after it. He sat at his desk instead with the original briefing packet open in front of him and a second copy, the one distributed to 13, pulled up on his tablet. Both were identical. Both had been sent through UA's internal server with read receipts and timestamp logs. He checked the logs 3 times, not because he expected to find something different on the 3rd pass, but because the absence of an anomaly was itself a data point. The schedule had reached someone it wasn't sent to. The logs showed no breach. Those 2 facts did not reconcile, which meant the breach had happened at a layer the logs didn't cover: a printed copy, a photograph, a conversation overheard at the wrong moment. Any of those was possible. None of them were traceable in the time available. He closed both documents and opened the USJ scheduling interface. The zone rotation for tomorrow's exercise ran on a fixed timetable, 8 zones, 4 instructor-led groups rotations every 20 minutes. He studied it, then began moving pieces. Not all of them. A complete overhaul would take hours and require rebriefing every instructor tonight. But the arrival sequence, the initial zone assignment, and the staff positioning those, he could shift. Small adjustments. Enough to make yesterday's intelligence unreliable without making the exercise unrecognizable. He saved the changes at 10:23 and sent a single message to Aizawa: schedule modified. Full briefing at 6 o'clock. Then he made a second call, not to the faculty and not logged on UA's internal system. The HPSC liaison picked up on the second ring, which told Nezu she'd been expecting it. We're aware. The liaison had clearly been expecting the call she cut in before he finished his first sentence. The audit flagged the packet distribution as a potential vector 3 weeks ago. We should have moved faster on containment. The audit flagged it as a potential vector, not a confirmed one. There's a difference. There was. A pause, precise and unapologetic. The exercise proceeds. We're not in a position to cancel. The coverage is already scheduled. The transport is arranged, and pulling back now creates more exposure than it closes. I've adjusted the schedule. Good. Keep the adjustments internal. Another pause, slightly longer. Your guest instructor. If the exercise becomes something other than routine, his involvement needs to stay below the threshold where we have to explain it. Nezu let that land. Outside the campus was still in the way. It only was after midnight, no movement. The practice grounds, empty. The overhead path lights running on their low overnight setting. He will do what he determines is necessary to protect the students. I can't constrain that, and I wouldn't if I could. What I can tell you is that his definition of necessary is narrower than you might expect. Narrow how? He doesn't act beyond what the situation requires. He's not interested in spectacle. Nezu closed the scheduling interface. What he is interested in is the students walking out. A silence on the line, shorter this time. Fine. Just make sure the incident report doesn't require us to explain what Mach 20 looks like on security footage. Nezu said he would do his best, which was not a promise, and ended the call. Aizawa had already been awake when the message arrived. He'd spent the previous hour running the most likely leak vectors on a notepad paper, not a device, and crossing them off one by one. A printed copy left unattended, possible untraceable. A staff member who'd seen the packet over someone's shoulder, possible narrow window. A compromise upstream before the packet was even generated possible, and the worst scenario because it meant the problem wasn't at UA at all. He crossed off the third option last and looked at what remained. At 6 in the morning, he was in Nezu's office with his coffee going through the modified schedule. The changes were deliberate in their modesty, the kind of adjustments that would read as routine to anyone working from yesterday's information. Arrival sequence shifted by 12 minutes. Initial zone assignments rotated one position. 13's entry point moved from the main gate to the secondary access. This buys us uncertainty. Aizawa kept his eyes on the revised map. Not security. Uncertainty is what 8 hours produces. Nezu wrapped both paws around his cup. Security would have required starting 3 weeks ago. Aizawa folded the printout twice and put it in his jacket. I'll brief 13 and the support staff at 7. Nothing written down. Agreed. A small pause. And the students? Koro-Sensei handles the students. He said it without preamble, without the qualifier he'd been attaching to the name for 2 days. They both registered it. Neither brought it up. Koro-Sensei arrived at the faculty building at 7:30 with a box of pastries which he left on the break room table with a note. For the people who were up late, you know who you are, and went directly to the small planning room at the end of B-Wing. He'd requested it the previous afternoon. Long table, movable chairs, a corkboard on one wall. He pinned a rough sketch of the USJ facility to the board zone layout. Major structural features, no classified detail. Then, he sat and waited. All Might found him at 7:50. He filled the doorframe the way large things fill spaces not designed for them. The hero form of this was Toshinori Yagi, in a collared shirt and an ill-fitting jacket holding the pastry box. You left these. You came because Nezu mentioned a meeting at 8 and you wanted to be early. Koro-Sensei gestured at the chair across the table. Keep the pastries. Sit. Toshinori sat with the careful adjustment of someone whose joints operated under a private set of agreements. He set the box down, but didn't open it. How much do you know about tomorrow? Enough to have adjusted my preparation. Not enough to have resolved my concern. Koro-Sensei's attention moved to the corkboard sketch. The schedule reached someone it wasn't sent to. The window where that could have happened is wide. Wide enough to matter. Toshinori held that information with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned over decades to carry very bad news without letting it travel across his face. If something goes wrong out there, something will be managed when it happens. A replacement, not a correction. The question is whether the management is loud or quiet. He turned from the board. Your job is hope. You arrive and the people around you believe immediately that the situation can be survived. That is a specific and real power, and it has specific and real limits. A pause measured. Mine is the morning. Making sure that by the time hope comes through the door, there's something left worth saving. Toshinori looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't offense. It was closer to recognition, the particular kind that arrives when someone else names a thought you've carried but never put into words. You've operated in places where the structure had already failed. Yes, and the people you were protecting went home. Koro-Sensei picked up the pastry box and placed it open between them. That's the complete answer. Everything else is method. He nodded toward the box. Eat. Nezu's briefing starts in 10 minutes, and he covers more ground on an empty stomach than most people do with notes. Toshinori took a pastry. A beat passed. You're not what I expected. No one ever is. The amber tone along his arms shifted fractionally lighter. Not quite the greenish amusement from 2 days ago, something with a little more weight to it. For what it's worth, neither are you. At 8:15, after Nezu's briefing, had covered the revised schedule and revised staff positions and the emergency contact chain, Koro-Sensei asked for 10 minutes with Class 1A before the transport left. Aizawa gave him 7 and stood at the back wall to keep it honest. The class had been told the schedule was adjusted for logistical reasons, not why. Most of them had processed this with the practical acceptance of students who've learned that adult decisions arrive without full explanations. Midoriya had not accepted it and was making a concentrated effort to look as if he had. Koro-Sensei stood at the front with nothing in his hands. 3 things. Then, the transport. 1 tentacle tip extended. When you arrive, count your group. If the number is wrong, don't move until it's right. A second. If anything disrupts the exercise, a sound that shouldn't be there, a change in the environment, anything, your first move is toward your gathering point, not toward the disruption. A third. The 60-second rule is not a practice rule. Treat the USJ like it's real. Bakugo, 3rd row, arms crossed. You're saying something's going to go wrong. I'm saying be ready for it. The tentacle lowered. 1 is a prediction. The other is a standard. They're not the same thing. His gaze moved across the room at an unhurried pace. I'll be there. So will Aizawa-sensei in 13. But the rule was never about what the adults do. You already know what it's for. Near the window, Todoroki. Being split up. When you're split up, not if, assume when, it makes the plan cleaner. 7 minutes. Aizawa moved from the wall. Transport's ready. The class shifted into motion. At the door, Midoriya paused with one hand on the frame, the same small hesitation as 2 days before. He didn't ask anything this time. He looked at Koro-Sensei the way someone checks an answer they already knew, gave a single nod, and stepped through. The transport left at 8:40. Nezu watched from his office window until it turned onto the main road and disappeared. The campus settled back into its standard morning configuration, orderly lit architecturally, committed to projecting calm. He turned back to his desk. His tablet was open to the security system. All access points logged all cameras running the overnight review completed and filed. The revised schedule had been confirmed received. Everything that could be adjusted had been adjusted. He sat down and opened the system's temp file directory, not standard procedure, not part of the normal workflow. He had checked it once at midnight and found the auto-generated backup copy of the original scheduled timestamp, 11:14 p.m., 3 days prior. He had flagged it and cleared it. He checked now from habit the same way he'd checked the server logs 3 times the previous evening. The directory was empty. The file was gone, but it had existed for 72 hours before anyone noticed. 72 hours was enough time for a photograph. Enough for a forwarded message. Enough if the recipient had been waiting for a plan built on information that UA now believed was obsolete and couldn't be entirely sure of. Nezu closed the directory. He looked at the empty road through the window, then reached for his tea. Tomorrow is a rescue lesson, he thought. Unless it isn't. The facility was larger than it looked from the access road. That was Midoriya's first thought when the main doors opened and the full scope of it resolved a structure built like a stadium that had swallowed a city block. The interior segmented into distinct areas visible from the central platform. Water, rubble, fire, open ground, each one engineered to fail in a different way. The lighting was high and even. The air smelled of concrete and something faintly chemical. The particular atmosphere of a space designed to simulate disaster without actually producing one. 13 stood at the railing above the landing zone, white suit and black helmet, one gloved hand resting on the rail. Welcome to the unforeseen simulation joint. Today's exercise covers coordinated rescue in multi-hazard environments. The scenario parameters will be assigned by sector. A pause that carried professional weight. The goal is not to neutralize threats. The goal is to get people out alive. Those are different objectives. Keep that distinction in your head for the next 2 hours. 20 students. Midoriya had counted on the transport and counted again when they crossed the threshold. 20. Behind them, near the rear wall of the entrance platform, Koro-Sensei stood with his clipboard mortarboard straight crescent moon tie undisturbed. He'd been silent since the transport. He was watching the layout the way someone watches a map they've already memorized, not to learn it, but to verify it against what they expected. Aizawa stepped to the front of the group. Rotation starts in 4 minutes. Zone assignments are posted on your tablets. Check them, find your group, and the lights changed. Not off, just wrong. A shift in the overhead quality, a half-second flicker that had no reason to happen in a controlled facility. Then the doors to the lower level swung open, and the mist came through them. Thus, it wasn't natural mist. It moved with direction, pooling at the base of the stairs and spreading outward in a shape that suggested intention rather than weather. Midoriya registered it in the same moment he registered the figures, stepping through too many to count at a glance, spreading fast across the platform below. Then the central column of mist thickened, and a voice came out of it. The schedule said All Might would be here. Shigaraki's tone was conversational, in the way a complaint is conversational, addressed to the air, not to any specific person. Fingers scratching at his own neck, the hands hanging from his clothes, clicking faintly against each other. Guess the schedule was wrong. He tilted his head toward the students on the platform above. Doesn't matter. Aizawa was already moving capture cloth, unwinding goggles down the particular shift in his posture that meant he'd already identified priority targets. 13 turned. Get behind me now. Then Kurogiri rose. The mist that had been spreading along the floor gathered, compressed, and took a form that wore a suit. Yellow eyes above a metal neck brace. The warp gate opened between one breath and the next. Not a door, not a hole, but an absence that the air fell into, and Midoriya felt the pull of it before he had time to think. He had approximately 3 seconds before the warp fully engaged. He used one of them to look for Koro-Sensei. The rear wall was empty. The flood zone hit him cold. Water up to mid-thigh debris floating in slow patterns. Visibility cut to 10 meters by the spray off the wave simulators someone had clearly activated remotely. Tsuyu was already there, one hand on an equipment rack bolted to the wall. Frog eyes scanning the water surface. Mineta was clinging to the same rack with the expression of someone reconsidering every decision that had led to this point. 2 of us. Tsuyu's voice had the flat economy of someone saving energy for useful things. I don't see anyone else. Mineta made a sound that was not words. Rule 2. Same tone, no acceleration. We need higher ground before we look for more people. She glanced at the rack at the wall above it, at the distance to a raised platform visible through the spray. I can get us there. Hold on. Mineta held on. She moved through the water with the unhurried efficiency of something that had not been designed for land in the first place, pulling them both toward the platform in a straight line that didn't waste motion on current or debris. She was at the ladder when the wave simulator cycled again, and the swell came from the left, higher than the previous one, higher than the design specifications allowed, which meant someone had overridden the controls. The swell hit the rack. Mineta's grip broke. He dropped. The water took him sideways. Then a tentacle came down from somewhere above the spray line, one fast yellow arc. And Mineta was deposited on the platform, like someone placing a package firmly without ceremony, still wearing the expression of imminent catastrophe. "Count heads." The voice came from above and was already receding. "Get to the gathering point. You know which one." The tentacle was gone before either of them saw where it had come from. Tsuyu climbed onto the platform, looked at Mineta, looked at the space where the tentacle had been. That answers one question. Come. In the ruin zone, Todoroki stood on a collapsed wall section and looked at the 3 vantage points available to him. The villains who'd warped in were mid-orientation. They'd expected a different layout, he could tell, from the way they were checking positions against something coordinates that didn't match what they were seeing. A revised schedule, he thought, without quite knowing where the thought came from. He had maybe 40 seconds before they finished adjusting. He didn't use the time to fight. He used it to build. Left hand out, slow exhale. Ice spread from the wall section in 2 directions simultaneously. Not walls, not weapons, just a raised border that defined a space. A clear area 20 meters across with one entrance and the rubble configured as cover rather than obstacle. The villains on the outer edge found their footing, redirected without quite understanding how. The 3 students who'd warped into the ruins with him found themselves in a space that made sense. Gathering point. Here, don't leave it. He hadn't been told to do that. He'd been shown how. Then, Midoriya landed in the open ground zone in a crouch and came up running before his knees had finished registering the impact. 3 villains between him and the nearest wall. He counted them the way Koro-Sensei had made them count casualties, not as threats, not as obstacles, but as a number. 3. He had a number. Numbers could be managed. He went left toward the structural pillar because the pillar was cover and the pillar was between him and the sector's only clear exit. One villain tried to cut him off. He went under the grab, full cowl active at the low percentage that didn't shatter his fingers, and put the pillar between them and kept moving. The second villain was faster. Midoriya pulled up short, and in the half-second of stalled momentum, he heard a voice from directly overhead. "Move right. 3 steps." He moved right. 3 steps. The second villain's lunge carried them into the wall instead of into Midoriya. The tentacle that had been above him was gone. He didn't stop to process it. He reached the exit, scanned the space. He'd seen 2 other students in the warp pull. They weren't visible. He stood at the exit for exactly 5 seconds, not because he wanted to, but because Rule 5 said the number had to match. And then Ida came through the debris pile on the left at a sprint, and Uraraka dropped from the elevated platform on the right, and the number matched. Gathering point. Midoriya was already scanning the route. Central column, I saw one marked there. Move. Ida was already calculating the route. Uraraka had a scrape across her forearm that wasn't serious. They moved. Across the facility, Aizawa was already 3 minutes into fighting alone and had no intention of stopping. He worked the way he always worked when numbers were bad efficiently, without elegance, targeting the villains with quirks that posed the highest immediate risk and neutralizing them before they could coordinate. His capture cloth had taken 2 impacts. His right shoulder would need attention later. He'd counted the students in his sightline when Kurogiri opened the gate, and now he ran the numbers against what he could see, the sectors he could monitor, the sectors he couldn't, the gap. 13 was holding the entrance platform black hole, keeping the villain line from advancing up the stairs. The students in the accessible areas were moving with more structure than they had any right to have, gathering, not scattering. Someone had trained them for this. He took down a 4th villain and didn't let himself think about the areas he couldn't see. Kurogiri didn't understand what was wrong. The gate should have been simple. The plan was built on a layout. He'd memorized a staff roster that had all might on the board, a student distribution that was supposed to take 8 seconds to scatter beyond recovery. None of it had held. The students were warped, but not isolated. The section he designated as the highest casualty sink the flood area had someone in it who wasn't on the roster. He tried to extend a gate toward the flood area. It formed held for 2 seconds, collapsed. He tried again. Same result. Something was moving between his gates and closing them. Not destroying them, just occupying the space they needed, appearing at the exact position where the warped geometry required an opening, and making that opening geometrically inconvenient. He couldn't see it. He could only see the results: a gate that should have reached the ruined section deflected. A gate toward the open ground exit, blocked for the 4 seconds it would have taken a student to be pulled through. It was operating from a map of his own geometry. That was the only explanation that fit. Kurogiri recalculated. The warp gate network ran on fixed geometric anchors. He knew the anchors, the distances, the angles required. Whatever was interfering had either been told those parameters or had derived them in real time. Real time meant fast. Very fast. He reported upward to Shigaraki in 3 words. "We have interference." Shigaraki scratched his neck. "Deal with it." "I am unable to locate it to deal with it." "It locates me." A pause stretched between them. "Fine." His voice dropped into the register reserved for plan revisions. "Then we moved to the contingency." Kurogiri opened the containment seal on the large storage unit in the facility's northeast corner. Midoriya reached the central column gathering point at the 9-minute mark and found 7 students already there. He counted them twice, habit now, and added his group of 3. 10 out of 20. The other 10 were in areas he couldn't reach from here, with teachers who were fighting on margins he didn't know, in a facility whose layout had been known to the wrong people 24 hours ago. Koro-Sensei appeared beside him. Without transition, one moment the space was empty, the next it wasn't. And the clipboard was gone, and the mortarboard was somehow still straight. 11 more to account for, Koro-Sensei said, looking outward across the facility. 7 inaccessible areas, 4 unconfirmed. He was doing something with his gaze that Midoriya had only seen once before in the gym. Scanning, cataloging running numbers against a map only he could see. Aizawa-sensei has the entrance. 13 has the stairs. The weak point is the gate. Midoriya processed that. If the gate goes down, they lose their separation advantage. 30 scattered villains become 30 villains in one space, which is a different problem, but a manageable one. He turned. Get the students here to count off and confirm injuries. Nobody goes back into a sector until I say. What are you going to do? Close the gap. He was gone before the sentence finished. Midoriya turned to the 10 students at the column. Okay, count off. Injuries first. Move. He didn't sound like he was pretending anymore. The last student cleared the flood area at the 11-minute mark. Koro-Sensei knew this, the way he knew the position of every student in the facility, not from watching, but from the absence of a specific kind of urgency. When someone was in immediate danger, something in his threat mapping registered it as a pull. When that pull stopped, it meant the position was stable. He'd spent the first 11 minutes moving between those pulls flood area first, because drowning doesn't negotiate, then the east corridor, because 2 students had warped into a space with no clear exit. Then a brief stop in the open ground area to redirect a villain charge that would have reached Uraraka before she found her footing. 12 interventions, under 2 seconds each. None of the students had seen most of them. Now the pulls were distributed and manageable. Not gone, never gone. Not with 30 villains still active, but spaced. The students were moving toward rally points. Aizawa was still fighting at the entrance with the controlled ferocity of someone who had decided to be the last problem standing. 13 had the stairs. The facility had a shape now. It had been chaos, and now it was a problem which was different. Koro-Sensei turned toward the central platform and the column of mist operating at its edge. Kurogiri was aware he was being watched before he could locate the source. This was new. In every operation, prior awareness had come from sighting a hero entering his range, a defensive formation closing in the predictable geometry of people moving through space. What he was experiencing now was awareness without vector, a certainty that something had fixed its attention on him and was currently deciding the most efficient angle of approach. He rotated a warp gate to cover his left flank. The gate formed cleanly held for 3 seconds, then destabilized, not from outside force, but from an obstruction at the anchor point that hadn't been there when he initiated the geometry. By the time he identified the obstruction and corrected for it, the window had passed. He tried the right flank. Same result, faster. Something was learning his anchor geometry in real time and placing itself at each one before the gate could fully open. This required either a predictive model of his own mechanics, which implied prior study, or a processing speed that could derive anchor positions from the geometry of his existing gates and pre-position faster than he could compensate. Both options were deeply inconvenient. He drew the mist tighter around his collar, reinforcing the one structural vulnerability he'd always known he had. The neck brace was a physical anchor, the one point his fog form couldn't fully dissolve around without losing coherence. He kept it covered at all times. He covered it now with an extra layer of dense vapor and shifted his orientation to put a wall of active mist between himself and whatever was circling him. The mist lasted 4 seconds before a tentacle came through it. Not an attack, not exactly. Attack. A contact precise and intentional at the outer edge of his neck brace, lasting less than a second before withdrawing. In that second, his fog form lost partial coherence in a 6-centimeter radius around the contact point, and the gate he'd been holding in reserve collapsed. He reformed. The coherence loss took 1.3 seconds to recover. In those 1.3 seconds, he couldn't open a gate. A voice came from behind him, not where the tentacle had been, somewhere else entirely. Your range is about 20 meters when you're maintaining 2 gates simultaneously. You drop to 12 when you're in active defense. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it took to say the next part. I've been watching your anchor geometry for 11 minutes. I know your range better than your planning team does. Kurogiri didn't respond. Responding would cost him a fraction of a second of focus. The neck is the only part of you that can't become mist. Koro-Sensei continued. Same conversational register as before, the tone of someone delivering technical information rather than making threats. Which means if I hold that point, you have a problem. And I move at Mach 20. A beat. You should start thinking about what you tell Shigaraki-san. Another tentacle. Same point, different angle. Another 1.3 seconds of recovery. Kurogiri tried to drive a portal directly beneath the pressure point, a technique that would have displaced the contact into the warp space. The anchor wouldn't seat. Something was already occupying the geometric position he needed. He recognized running out of angles. From the upper walkway where he'd retreated to get sight lines, Midoriya tracked what he could see of the exchange below and tried to process it in real time. What he could see Kurogiri trying to open gates that kept collapsing at the last second. Shigaraki pacing near the base of the stairs with the specific agitation of someone whose plan had stopped working. Koro-Sensei appearing in Kurogiri's vicinity every 40 to 60 seconds and then vanishing before the eye could track the departure. What he could infer, the gates were failing because Koro-Sensei was blocking anchor points. Kurogiri's range was being compressed. The mist form that had scattered 20 students across the complex was now too busy defending itself to scatter anyone else. What this meant, the separation advantage was gone. The villains who'd been spread across the building coordinating through gate repositioning were now isolated from that coordination. 30 scattered threats without a mobility hub were a different kind of problem, dangerous regardless but bounded. He ran the numbers. 14 students at rally points, 3 in transit. He could see the trajectory from Hirsera Najiro coming through the East Corridor Kaminari 40 seconds behind. That left 3 unaccounted for. Ida. He said it to nobody. Ida wasn't there to hear it. Please be running. And Ida was running. He had left the main facility via the secondary exit at the 8-minute mark, moving at the speed that had earned him his hero name, and then some covering ground with the mechanical efficiency of reciprocating engines at full throttle. His instructions were simple, and he'd been given them by himself. Rule 4, say so in the first 10 seconds. He'd said so. Now he had to get somewhere saying so would matter. The access road stretched ahead. His legs were already at 70%, and he pushed them to 80, because 30 villains and 2 compromised teachers and 20 classmates who were currently surviving on 2 days of emergency training was a very good reason to not be conservative about his own limits. He didn't let himself think about what was happening behind him. He thought about the road, the gate at the end of it, the distance between where he was and where help was. All tractable problems. He ran.
Chekhov Otman.
Shigaraki watched the mist at the center of the platform fail for the 4th time and made a decision. The plan had depended on All Might. All Might wasn't here. The contingency had depended on the gate staying operational. That resource was now compromised. The second contingency, the one Sensei had told him not to use unless everything else failed, was standing in the northeast corner of the facility in a containment pod that had already been unsealed. He walked toward it, not because he wanted to. Using the Nomu meant admitting the scope of the failure, and Shigaraki did not enjoy admitting anything. But the yellow thing had Kurogiri backed into a corner. The students were consolidating instead of scattering. The pro-hero who was supposed to have been dealt with in the first 4 minutes was still fighting at the entrance, and Shigaraki had been in enough operations to recognize the moment when cutting losses stopped being an option and winning ugly became the only remaining one. He opened the pod. The Nomu stepped out with the particular absence of hesitation that came from having nothing inside it that hesitated. It was large. It was dark. The exposed brain matter above its eyes registered no discomfort at the ambient light. It looked at Shigaraki and waited. The teacher. The one who won't stop moving. The Nomu's head turned. Somewhere in its modified neural architecture, an instruction seated itself, and something that functioned like intent formed behind those blank eyes. It moved toward the center of the space. Koro-Sensei was mid-sequence on Kurogiri's 4th recovery window tentacle. Positioned anchor blocked the neck brace, contact point identified and ready, when the Nomu entered his peripheral awareness. He didn't stop what he was doing. He completed the contact, held it for the full 1.3-second window, let Kurogiri's coherence lapse, and stepped back. Then he looked at the Nomu properly. Large, modified, the kind of construction that had been built to specific tolerances. Shock absorption layered into the muscle architecture, regenerative capacity, and the tissue density. The whole assembly optimized for a single tactical purpose: absorb everything a symbol of peace could produce and keep moving. He could read the design logic in the body plan, the way a professional reads intent in a blueprint. Built to fight All Might. All Might wasn't here. Nuru fufufu. The sound was quiet, not a performance, just a reflex. The noise his system made when it encountered a problem that had been constructed without accounting for him. Quiet directed at nothing. A system response, not a performance. Then the amber tone along his arms shifted to something cooler and more deliberate, and he put himself between the Nomu and the position where 14 students were holding. Not because the Nomu scared him, because that was where he needed to be.
By timing.
At the rally point, Midoriya heard the sound carry across the facility, brief, almost imperceptible, under the ambient noise of an ongoing crisis, and recognized it from 2 days ago in the Gymnasium, when Koro-Sensei had looked at a problem and decided it was interesting. Then, he looked at what had just stepped into the open and stopped being interested in the sound. Okay. He turned to the 14 students behind him. His voice didn't shake. He'd earned that. Tighter formation. Nobody moves from this position unless I say, or Aizawa-sensei says. He made eye contact with Todoroki, who was already adjusting his stance toward the perimeter. Todoroki, can you give us a barrier? Already working on it. The ice came up in a low arc around the rally point's rear exposure. Not a wall, a redirection, the same logic Todoroki had used in the ruins. It would buy 30 seconds if the Nomu came this way. Maybe 40. Midoriya looked at Koro-sensei's position between the Nomu and the group unmoving, watching the construct orient itself, and thought about what Koro-sensei had said in the planning room 2 days ago. Making sure that by the time hope comes through the door, there's something left worth saving. The Nomu took its first step. Koro-sensei didn't move yet. That first step cracked the concrete. Not from weight alone, the construction floor was rated for industrial loads. It cracked because something in its movement had no concept of gradual force application. It didn't walk so much as it transferred mass from one point to another, each step a controlled fall that the ground absorbed whether or not it was ready. The sound traveled across the open space like a period at the end of a sentence. Midoriya felt it through his shoes. Todoroki's ice barrier had gone up at the rally point's rear, low-angled, designed to redirect rather than block. Bakugo was at the left perimeter, crouched, both palms open, not moving. The students behind Midoriya had pulled together without being told the way a group does when it suddenly understands that the distance between itself and a threat has become the most important number in the room. The Nomu covered 10 meters in 2 seconds without appearing to accelerate. It wasn't heading for Koro-sensei. It was heading for the group. Koro-sensei moved on the third step. Not before would have been reactive, which was the wrong register for this. He'd spent 3 seconds reading its locomotion pattern, the way its mass distributed on impact. The angle of its forward lean, the absence of any lateral awareness that would adjust for an obstruction in its path. It had been designed with a single tactical purpose, and everything extraneous had been removed, including the capacity to adapt when the target moved. He put himself between the Nomu and the group at Mach 4, not full speed, because full speed at this distance would have put him through the far wall. And its forward momentum carried it directly into a tentacle brace that stopped neither its speed nor its intent, only redirected both. The impact registered somewhere along Koro-sensei's structure as significant. He let it because absorbing force was faster than deflecting it, and he had the margin. It stumbled 2 steps left and reoriented. Back to the column. No turn, no pause. All of you, move now. Nobody argued. Midoriya counted 14 and started walking backward, watching the space in front of him. Bakugo peeled off the perimeter and moved, not running the controlled retreat of someone who'd been told to hold a position and was now being told to change it, and understood that both were tactics. It reoriented and charged again. It hit differently the second time. Koro-sensei had expected the shock absorption. The body plan had made it obvious, the dense layering and the muscle architecture designed to take everything All Might produced and distribute it harmlessly. What he hadn't fully accounted for was the speed at which the regenerative capacity reset the construct's orientation after each deflection. 3 seconds. Maybe 2.5. 2.5 seconds was fast. Not faster than him, but fast enough that the gap between deflections was narrower than comfortable. He adapted. The math wasn't difficult if 2.5 seconds was the reset window he needed each deflection to carry the Nomu further from the student group than the previous one. Cumulative displacement. Not a single dramatic move, a sequence of small ones, each adding distance, each exploiting the construct's complete inability to recognize that it was being steered. Third impact. 6 meters left of the group's position. Fourth. 8 meters toward the passage running along the facility's east wall. It couldn't course correct mid-charge. It could only reorient after each reset. Koro-Sensei was at the next position before the reset finished. Nick, Todoroki watched from the column's edge, tracking the geometry. He'd seen the pattern by the third, redirect the construct drifting slightly further from center, each time the trajectory curving toward the east corridor without anything that looked like a plan from the outside. From the outside, it looked like chaos, Koro-Sensei moving in short bursts, the thing charging and stumbling and recharging. From the inside, if you'd spent 2 days learning to read a situation, instead of just reacting to it, it looked like a controlled walk toward a specific destination. He turned to the group. When that thing clears the main space, it's going to come back around. I need everyone against the rear wall. He didn't raise his voice. He'd found that not raising his voice made people listen faster. Injured on the inside, mobile on the outside. Go! They went. He turned back to the passage entrance and put up a low wall of ice across it, not enough to stop it, enough to cost it a reset. That was all Koro-Sensei would need. He hadn't been told to do that, either. 3 corridors over Azawa hit the ground. Not down horizontal, rolling clear of a decay attempt that had taken the edge off his capture cloth. He came up on one knee, assessed the damage. Cloth was compromised at the tip, still functional for 40% of its range. 2 villains left in his immediate sector, both quirkless or with quirks he'd already neutralized. His shoulder had stopped cooperating about 4 minutes ago. He took down the closer of the 2 with the cloth's functional range. The second one ran. He let it go and looked toward the central space. The sounds coming from there were wrong. Not the sounds of a fight which had a rhythm he could parse, but the sounds of something large being moved repeatedly against its intentions. He'd heard that kind of sound once before in a different context, and it had meant something very specific. Someone was running a tactic, not a brawl. He retrieved his cloth, checked his footing, and moved toward the central space. The 9th redirect put the Nomu into the east corridor entrance. Koro-Sensei felt the shift the moment it happened, the Nomu's charge carrying it fully past the threshold into the narrower space where its mass became a liability rather than an asset. Corridors meant walls. Walls meant its forward momentum had nowhere to go but the direction it was already pointed. He was already in the corridor ahead of it, 140 meters down, when the Nomu entered. He looked back at it once at the construct running toward him with the absolute purposefulness of something that had only one instruction and was currently following it perfectly, and thought briefly about the simplest solution. One fast enough to end this in under a second. Technically available. Clean. He set it aside. The students were safe. The corridor was empty. The problem in front of him did not require the simplest solution. What it required was a wall. He hit the Nomu at a calculated angle, drove it left again, and the third drive put it through the corridor's emergency partition and into the sealed maintenance section beyond. That partition was rated for fire and impact. It wouldn't hold indefinitely. The Nomu would work through it in 4 minutes, maybe 3. But 3 minutes was enough time to change the shape of a situation entirely. The sounds from the maintenance section were immediate and percussive. Koro-Sensei turned and went back toward the main space. Sat. Shigaraki heard the partition go and understood what it meant without needing to analyze it. The construct was contained. Not destroyed, he could hear it working on the partition, the steady rhythmic impact of something that didn't know how to stop, but removed from the board. The gate was compromised. His subordinates in the open areas were disorganized and increasingly not fighting, which meant the pro-hero at the entrance had been more effective than projected. The plan was done. The contingency was done. What remained was the decision about whether to stay or leave, and the answer to that was obvious, which Shigaraki found infuriating, because leaving felt like the plan admitting to something. He scratched at his neck and looked at the entrance. He could still reach one of the students. One casualty, one statement, one proof that this incursion had meant something. He started walking toward the group at the column, the hand on his face, angled down. Fingers spread all 5, which was how it worked. A tentacle came out of nowhere and wrapped his right wrist. Not a grip, a stop. The pressure was precise and absolute, and Shigaraki found himself looking at 4 of his fingers instead of 5. The wrist locked at an angle that would require him to use his left hand to break the hold. And his left hand was not in a position to break anything. "That direction, Taman," Koro-Sensei said from immediately behind him, "is finished for today." Shigaraki tried to pull. The hold didn't shift. "Kurogiri, currently unavailable." The tone was the same one he used in classrooms. Conversational, not cruel, the voice of someone explaining a consequence rather than delivering a punishment. "And your window for this was 3 minutes ago. You've been running on momentum since then." Shigaraki's free hand found a piece of rubble. Koro-Sensei removed it without appearing to move his attention. "Touching a student," Koro-Sensei said, "was not going to happen. I want to make sure you understand that specifically, because the next time you plan something like this, the information should be accurate." A beat brief and final. "Sit down, please." Shigaraki sat. Not because he wanted to, because the alternative required muscles that were currently occupied. Across the main space, the 14 students at the column were watching. Midoriya had his notebook open. He'd stopped writing at some point in the last 2 minutes and hadn't noticed until now. The wrist hold had lasted 40 seconds before Kurogiri managed to pull himself back into coherence and form a gate large enough for extraction. Koro-Sensei let it happen. Not because he couldn't close it. He could have been at the warp geometry before it fully seated the same way he'd been blocking anchor points for the past 18 minutes. He let it happen because Kurogiri carrying Shigaraki out of the building was a better outcome than Shigaraki staying in it, and because the moment the gate opened, Shigaraki's wrist came free. The 5 fingers spread. Koro-Sensei had already moved. He came down on Shigaraki's right hand from above. Not a strike a pin, all 5 fingers pressed flat against the concrete before the decay could find a target. The impact was controlled and final. Shigaraki's palm hit the ground and stayed there. "The gate," directed at Kurogiri, quiet. Kurogiri, half-formed in the extraction portal, assessed the situation in the particular way that people who have been outmaneuvered assess situations, quickly looking for an exit that wasn't the obvious one. He found nothing. The yellow figure was between him and every student in the building, occupying the geometry he needed, with the patience of something that had been doing this longer than Kurogiri had been operational. He closed the gate. Shigaraki exhaled through his teeth. His palm was still flat on the ground, held there by one tentacle tip, with the specific pressure of someone who had calculated exactly how much force was required and applied exactly that amount. "You can't hold me here forever." "I don't need to." Koro-Sensei didn't look at him. He was watching the area around them, the remaining villains who drifted toward the walls when the Nomu went down the group at the column who hadn't moved Aizawa's position near the entrance. Running numbers. I need to hold you here for approximately 4 more minutes. The response team will manage the rest. They'll let me go. That's their decision. A pause, not hesitation, just the gap between one thing and the next. Mine was made when you walked toward those students. The remaining villains didn't rush the position. Midoriya noticed this from the column, the way the ones still standing had pulled back to the walls after the Nomu went silent, and Shigaraki went down. Not retreating exactly. More like recalibrating, trying to determine whether the calculus of the situation justified anything further. Looking at each other. Looking at Koro-Sensei's back, looking away. Ida wasn't back yet, but the UA-say response protocol had a built-in timer, 8 minutes from first contact outside the building to first responder arrival, and they were past that window. Count off. His voice stayed level. Starting from Todoroki. They went through it in under 30 seconds. 19 names. He ran the tally in his head while they spoke everyone present at the column, plus Aizawa visible near the entrance. The 20th name didn't come. Ida's outside? Not a question. He left at the 8-minute mark. He's the one who called this in. A brief silence. Then someone Kirishima by the voice said, "So he did the right thing." He did exactly the right thing. Todoroki was at the perimeter watching the villain line with the specific attention of someone prepared to act and hoping not to need to. His ice barrier at the column's rear had held. He hadn't needed to use it. He let it stand anyway, because a boundary that hadn't been tested was still a boundary. Aizawa crossed from the entrance at a controlled walk, not running because running would communicate urgency to everyone who remained watching. An urgency invited responses he didn't want to manage right now. His shoulder had stopped registering as a discrete problem and become part of the general noise of the last 23 minutes. He reached the column and ran a visual sweep. 19 students. One pro-hero visible at the far end holding a 20-year-old villain flat on the ground. The other pro-hero holding a perimeter she'd held for the entire duration without once leaving it. Good enough. Not perfect, the scene would need to be picked apart for weeks. The audit would find things to criticize. The press would find things to amplify. But the students were standing, and they were counting, and nobody had a hand around anyone's throat. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the response team lead, who confirmed arrival in 90 seconds. The second was to Nezu, who picked up before the first ring finished. All students accounted for. 1 teacher with injuries, 2 villains immobilized. 1 Nomu contained in the East Maintenance section. Do not open that door until we have quirk suppression on site. A brief silence on Nezu's end. Understood. And your guest instructor, Aizawa looked across the space at the yellow figure kneeling over a prone Shigaraki with the patient attention of someone waiting for a bus. Present and apparently fine. He ended the call and went to stand next to 13, who had not moved from the entrance platform and showed no signs of planning to. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "My suit took 2 hits. "My suit is good. Ask me again in an hour." A pause. "Are they all there?" "All 19 at the column. Ida's outside." 20. 13 answered. 20. My. Koro-Sensei heard the response team coming before they entered the frequency of boots on concrete, the specific acoustics of multiple people moving in formation through the access corridor. 40 seconds out. He used 30 of them to do a final sweep of the room, villain positions, student positions, structural integrity of the maintenance section door. The door was holding. The sounds behind it had changed rhythm, which meant the construct had found the hinges and was working on the structural weak points rather than the face. Smarter approach? It would buy another 6 minutes, maybe 7. He looked down at Shigaraki. The young man on the ground was 20 years old and had spent those 20 years building a specific architecture of grievance into something operational. It was, in its way, an impressive piece of construction, the kind of focused damage that required consistency over time. Koro-Sensei had seen it before in different configurations pointed at different targets. He'd also seen what it looked like when it unraveled and what was left when it did. He could end this more completely. The thought arrived and he noted it and set it aside the same way he'd set aside the simpler solution in the corridor. The students were safe. The threat was contained. The problem in front of him now belonged to a different system, and that system had people arriving in 10 seconds to take custody of it. You'll be processed. Not a threat, an itinerary. Questioned. Probably held for some time. The people behind this, the ones who built you into what you are, they'll have moved on to contingencies that don't include your release. Shigaraki said nothing. His palm remained flat. That's worth thinking about. While you have time, the response team came through the main doors. The next 4 minutes were organized noise. Response team spreading through the building in practiced formation. Hero-licensed, quirk-equipped, doing the work of consolidating a scene that had already been largely consolidated for them. Villains being secured. Statements being taken. The maintenance section door getting a quirk suppression unit installed before anyone looked at what was behind it. Midoriya watched from the column and tried to hold the shape of the last 27 minutes in his head as a single thing. He couldn't. It kept breaking into pieces. The flood zone Todoroki's ice paths, the sound of Koro-Sensei's single laugh in the corridor, Ida running before anyone told him to. Each piece felt separately too large to fit inside a normal hour. Kaminari was sitting on the ground with his back against the column, looking at his hands. Uraraka had a bandage on her forearm from a response team medic. Bakugo had not sat down once. Rule 5. To no one in particular. Nobody leaves until the number matches. 20 watt from the perimeter. Ida came through the main doors. 90 seconds later, slightly out of breath, still in his UA tracksuit, surrounded by 4 pro heroes who had clearly been struggling to match his pace from the access road. He crossed the space, found the column, found the group. He looked at them. He counted. 20. No one needed to add anything to that. Nezu received the full incident report at his desk at 11:42 in the morning. He read it without interrupting the way he read everything, once quickly retaining it whole. 20 students, 0 fatalities, 3 injuries, none critical, 2 villains in custody, 1 Nomu contained and awaiting suppression team, 13 with suit damage, Aizawa with a dislocated shoulder and several lacerations currently refusing transport to the hospital, which was predictable, 1 guest instructor uninjured, who had declined to provide a formal statement pending HPSC review. He set the report down and looked at the window. Outside, past the campus perimeter, he could see the edge of what was going to become a press situation. 2 vehicles already. By the afternoon, there would be 20. By tomorrow morning, the question being asked on every major news platform would be, how did a villain incursion reach a UA training facility, and what exactly had contained it? The HPSC liaison would call within the hour. Nezu already knew what she would say. Control the narrative, minimize the anomaly, preserve the institution's credibility. He would listen carefully and respond thoughtfully, and then do what he had always done, which was protect the students first and manage the consequences after. His tablet showed the final student roll call. 20 names all checked. Now, quiet to no one in particular, the real work begins. The press had 17 cameras outside the main gate by the morning after the attack. By day 3, they had 31. By day 7, when the formal review convened, they had 46 cameras and 2 satellite trucks. And the question being asked on every platform had sharpened from what happened at USJ into something more specific and considerably more uncomfortable. Who or what actually stopped it? Nezu had anticipated the sequence. He hadn't anticipated the speed.
The
The review board met in UA's administrative conference room on the 7th day, which was the earliest the HPSC liaison could arrange a room that didn't have a journalist in an adjacent one. 7 people around a long table, Nezu at one end, the HPSC liaison at the other. Aizawa and 13 on one side, 2 commission representatives, and a government observer on the other. The liaison had opened with the incident summary and moved directly to the part everyone in the room had been thinking about since the satellite trucks arrived. The public record shows an unidentified individual neutralized the primary threat and secured 20 students. The security footage is selective. We've managed the narrative as far as the first responders' statements allow. What we haven't managed is the gap between what people know happened and what we can plausibly explain. The gap, Nezu set down his cup, is approximately Mach 20. A silence around the table. The government observer wrote something down. We can't sell Monster Teacher to the public. Not after a school attack. The optics, Aizawa said from the middle of the table, are that 20 students are alive. He hadn't looked up from the tabletop. That's the only number I've been tracking since the incident. Every other number is yours to manage. The liaison absorbed this with the expression of someone who had expected it and still found it inconvenient. I understand your perspective, erase your head. The Commission's position is that institutional credibility requires... The Commission's position pleasantly requires that we first establish what the actual failure was before we decide what story to tell about it. He set down his tea. A training facility was accessed by a coordinated villain group using intelligence that was extracted from our internal scheduling system. That is the gap the public should be concerned about. The question of who contained the damage is secondary. It isn't secondary to the question of what we tell parents. Then tell them their children are alive and the vulnerability has been addressed. Nezu's tone remained pleasant throughout. Both of those things are true. The liaison looked at him across the table. And your guest instructor, his continued presence at this institution requires our authorization. His continued presence at this institution requires his agreement. Ask him. Don't authorize him. Koro-Sensei was in the small B-Wing planning room. When Nezu came to find him, the same room where he'd met Toshinori a week ago, the corkboard still showing the USJ sketch with pencil marks he'd added during the debrief. He was reading what appeared to be 4 student reports, simultaneously, one tentacle holding each. He set them down when Nezu entered. The review went as expected, he asked. Within normal parameters for a crisis meeting that nobody wanted to have. Nezu took a chair. The commission would like to formalize your role, give you a classification, a liability framework, a set of operational boundaries. And what would I give them in return? Predictability primarily. Koro-Sensei was quiet. The corkboard sketch had 20 small marks on it, one for each student added at some point during the week in a cluster near the central column. My operational boundaries are the students. If they're safe, I operate within whatever framework is useful. A pause carrying no particular heat. One clarification for the Commission's record. If children are ever used as bait again by anyone in any arrangement, I won't negotiate. I'll simply stop it. He didn't raise his voice. That's not a threat. It's a description of how I function. That's what I told her. And she wrote it down, which means she's going to spend the next month deciding whether it's a threat or a policy statement. He tilted his head. I suspect it's both. It's neither. It's a description of how I function. I gave the same description to Aizawa-sensei on the first day. He picked up the student reports again. Tell the commission whatever keeps them cooperative. The students are what matter. Nezu looked at the corkboard. 20 marks, all present. Yes, they are. Toshinori found him in the same room an hour later, Nezu having apparently circulated the location and stood in the doorway briefly before coming in. He'd been at the review board session in a consulting capacity, which meant he'd sat in the corner and said nothing and absorbed everything with the expression of a man running a very long internal calculation. The calculation had apparently concluded. I should have been there. Yes, Koro-Sensei said. Not unkindly. If the schedule hadn't... The schedule was changed because someone extracted it. That's a systemic failure, not a personal one. He looked up from the reports. You would have been there if the timing had been different. The timing wasn't different. What was there instead handled the situation. He set the reports down. People need hope. I understand that. I've seen what happens when it runs out. Toshinori was quiet. Kids need tomorrow. A straightforward statement, no particular weight on it. That's what I was there for. Not to replace what you represent, to make sure there was still something for it to apply to. He picked up the reports again. Your job and mine aren't in competition. They're sequential. Toshinori looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who had carried a particular weight for a very long time and had just been offered not relief from it, but a different way to hold it. Sequential. You come after the situation is survivable. I make it survivable, in that order. The debriefing with Class 1A happened in their homeroom on day 5 before the formal review. Because Aizawa had determined that 20 teenagers processing a crisis without any structured framework was a worse outcome than the paperwork delay. He ran it straight the way he ran everything. No preamble, no emotional scaffolding. Just the sequence of events and the gaps in it. I want to know what worked. Not what you wish had worked, what actually worked from the second the portals opened. A beat. Then Suyu with a flat delivery that made everything she said sound like established fact. The gathering point. Mineta and I both knew exactly where to go. We didn't have to decide. The Count, Midoriya said. He was holding his notebook but hadn't opened it. Every time I didn't know what to do, I counted. It gave me something to do with the first 10 seconds. The exit. Bakugo said it like he was filing a report, holding it. When everyone else was moving toward things holding position, meant there was something to come back to. Aizawa let the silence after that run for 2 seconds. Those are the 3 things that worked. They're also the 3 things you were specifically taught 4 days before the incident. He looked across the room. Draw whatever conclusion you want from that. Kirishima near the back. If we hadn't had the rule, what would have happened? Nobody answered immediately. Then Uraraka quietly. I would have gone after the nearest villain when the portals opened, instead of toward the gathering point. A silence. I don't think that ends well. The room held that. Koro-Sensei was standing at the back wall where he'd been since the session started. He hadn't spoken. He'd been doing what Aizawa was doing, watching logging, reading the things people didn't say in the spaces between what they did. "Is everyone here?" he asked. Midoriya looked up. "Yes." "Count for me." Midoriya counted. 20? Good. That was the whole of it. No elaboration, no lesson appended. The number was enough. The formal incident report, submitted to the HPSC, ran to 43 pages. The section on the special instructor was 3 paragraphs deliberately vague, citing classification protocols and ongoing assessment. The liaison had written those paragraphs herself, and Nezu had approved them without amendment because they were accurate in all the ways that mattered and imprecise in all the ways that were useful. The school reopened on day 8. The 46 cameras had dropped to 12, and 3 of those were from outlets that had already moved on to other stories and were only maintaining a presence out of institutional inertia. Koro-Sensei was in the B-Wing planning room when the first students arrived back on campus. He watched them from the window. Not the way he'd watched the empty courtyard on the first day, counting down to something, but with a different quality of attention that comes when the thing you were watching for has already happened. He would be here for 3 more weeks. 2 if the commission moved faster than expected. The arrangement had an end date, and the end date was approaching. And the work between now and then was the same work it had always been, 20 students 1 hour at a time, making sure the number matched. Below in the courtyard, Midoriya had stopped walking and was looking up at the window. He had his notebook. He didn't wave. He just looked the way he'd looked in the doorway on the first day, confirming something he'd already calculated. Koro-Sensei didn't wave either. He simply looked back and let the number run quietly in the back of his mind, the way it always did. 20. All present. The corkboard behind him still had the marks on it. He hadn't taken them down.